You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
And as always, remember to click the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, like and share our episodes, tell your friends, and leave us a positive review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on. All of that really helps us. We've got another great episode lined up. It's actually part 2 of a two-part series that we're doing, looking at a book which we're going to think about in just a moment. But before we kind of get into the topic today, Todd, we're now around the end of March, and spring has sprung. Is that right, in Tennessee?
Yeah, technically, there's flowers out already, and I mean it's still cold, but and wet. But yeah, we've got flowers coming up. There's little green buds coming out on some of the trees. We'll be yeah, any time now we should, April comes in and we should have a good, nice spring happening here. Easter right around the corner. So are you still frozen in over there, snowed in and so forth?
No, the weather's improving, and it always lightens the mood, doesn't it? As you know that spring is coming, and the days get a bit longer. Always lifts the mood, and you have nice days to look forward to and nice evenings, so that's great. In fact, I think spring and autumn are probably my 2 favorite seasons of the year. Summer, I don't always cope terribly well with the heat, and I don't like the cold in the winter, so I do like the spring and the autumn. So, Todd, we are back for part 2, as I mentioned, of this series that we're doing about this new book that has come out. It's this book, In Quest of the Historical Adam, A Biblical and Scientific Exploration, by William Lane Craig. And I guess some of our listeners are going to know who William Lane Craig is, and we told people last time, but just for those who are joining us now, fill us in. Who is William Lane Craig?
Yeah, William Lane Craig is a extremely famous evangelical philosopher. He's known for his work on the cosmological argument, particularly a form of the cosmological argument called the Kalam cosmological argument. And for those of you who don't necessarily keep up with all this Christian apologetic stuff, a cosmological argument is an argument for the existence of God based on the existence of stuff. So we look around and we see stuff has a beginning. And so all of the stuff in the universe, therefore, must also have a beginning. And there you go. That's an argument for something beyond the universe that made it. And obviously, that is a terrible oversimplification. If Dr. Craig is listening, I'm sure you'll be happy to correct me. So that's William Lane Craig. He's known for that. He's written dozens of books. He's got a pretty prominent website called Reasonable Faith. He's a professor at Houston Baptist University. And he's written this book on the Adam controversy. Now, the Adam controversy has been going on for more than a decade now in evangelical academic circles here in the United States, especially, where there's a lot of sort of wrestling with the issue of human evolution and how much of that should we sort of incorporate into evangelical theology and so forth. So this is a book written from the perspective of theistic evolution, and the listener should know that. And if you heard the last episode, you heard us talk all about mythology and mytho-history and how we should read the Bible and so forth. So this episode is more about the science.
Yeah, that's right. So last time we were joined by biblical scholar Dr. Hans Madawamy, and as you say, we kind of dug into some of the biblical and theological aspects of William Lane Craig's new book. This time we want to look at the kind of scientific case that he presents. And in order to help us do that, we're joined by another very special guest, Dr. Marcus Ross. Marcus, it's great to have you with us here today.
Hey, thanks. It's wonderful to be back on with you guys for Let's Talk Creation.
That's great. Yes. Now, Marcus has been a guest on the podcast before when we talked to you about the genealogical Adam hypothesis that Joshua Swamidass has proposed. So some of our listeners will know you from there, and others will, of course, know you as one of the scientists who featured in the Is Genesis History documentary. Marcus has a PhD in geoscience from the University of Rhode Island, where he studied a group of creatures called mosasaurs, extinct marine lizards. And thank goodness they are extinct, hey, Marcus?
Indeed, praise the Lord. They are. They were something else. Anywhere from 12 to 50 plus feet in length, generally all kind of generalist carnivores in the ocean. There were a few specialized forms, but when they're depicted on Jurassic World, they might be a little bit big, but at the same time, they're still pretty horrible creatures.
That's great. Marcus is also one of the authors of this excellent textbook, The Heavens and the Earth, Excursions in Earth and Space Science. And that's definitely well worth looking up on Amazon or with your local bookstore. The Heavens and the Earth, highly recommended. Marcus is also the founder and CEO of Cornerstone Educational Supply, as well as formerly a professor of geology at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. Marcus, just tell us, where do people find Cornerstone Educational Supply if they want to look you up?
Oh, sure. Well, Cornerstone, my wife likes to say we are the stuff people. So if your homeschool curriculum or your Christian school or college is looking for science equipment and material, we provide that sort of stuff to go along with it. So whether it's beakers or dissection specimens or geology kits, a particular specialty of ours, you can find us on the web at cornerstone-edsupply.com. So cornerstone-edsupply.com. And you'll see that we've got a wide variety of different sorts of materials. We do a lot of customized work, produce kits for publishers and the like for when they need materials for their high school biology or chemistry or physics classes, those sorts of things.
That's great. So do go and have a look at the website of Cornerstone Educational Supply and give them your custom. That would be absolutely fantastic. Now, Marcus,
much appreciated.
Marcus, you're here because we want to talk to you about the scientific case that William Lane Craig makes in this book on Adam. And Todd, I think you're going to kick us off with our first question for Marcus.
Sure, yeah. So last time we talked about treating people well and being fair and nice and not just ganging up and piling on somebody that we disagree with. So I want to start with, what do you think is important and valuable about this book?
Now that's a really good question, because obviously as young Earth creationists, young age creationists, we're going to have some big disagreements. Really big disagreements with Craig's approach. And yet, here we have a scholar who has obviously invested the last several years looking into this topic and kind of saying, it's about time that I address this from my perspective. And first off, I want to appreciate that kind of effort that goes into it. This is no small book. I've got my copy here, right? We all got our copy. Yeah. This is a dense read that is,
400 pages.
It required a determined effort on the part of Craig to address wide-ranging topics from, literary analysis to hermeneutics and exegesis to anthropology, genetics. I mean, it's a lot to cover. So first off, my kudos to Craig for tackling a project that is so interdisciplinary as something like this. As far as a specific example of something that I appreciated in the book, one of the things that within this realm of the questions of Adam, particularly from those who approach it from an old Earth or a theistic evolutionary side of things, is that the focus tends to be on Homo sapiens. And when did Adam as a Homo sapiens member come about? Is there a way for us to make Adam Homo sapiens? And Swamidass approaches that by saying only if he's genealogical. Others would say, no, there's no way, because there never were only two Homo sapiens. There was a pool of thousands. And so on some theistic evolutionists, you've got folks saying there's no Adam, it has to be mythological. Others are trying to adopt a genealogical view that if Adam's just our great ancestors somewhere, that's fine enough. And Craig says you're missing some other members of the fossil record, of the hominid record, that are clearly human, particularly Neanderthals. And so I was really impressed with some of the cataloging of evidences for the humanity of the Neanderthals that Craig goes through. It's not a small amount. Yeah. He spends a good deal of time because from his perspective, if the archaeological and anthropological evidence for humanity is displayed through artwork, through tool making, etc., then what we see in Homo sapiens is oftentimes mirrored by what is seen amongst the Neanderthals, or at least close enough that you say, these are equivalent levels of technology, sophistication, living arrangements, potential evidence for spirituality. And Craig's basic argument here is that if you're going to call certain things that we find in the record from Homo sapiens human, there is no way that you can exclude the Neanderthals. And to do so is an affront to what really appears to be their humanity. And that was refreshing, very, very refreshing to read in an old Earth advocate. And I agreed with a lot of what Bill Craig was saying about that. It's not surprising. Young Earth creationists have been saying that Neanderthals are human for many decades. Long time. many decades. Yeah, we're kind of the first ones on the block with this. But it was really neat to see some of the arguments and evidence that Craig brought forth on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm trying, as you were talking, I was trying to think, has there ever been another sort of theistic evolution perspective person who has tried to make that argument? I think they all just sort of just assume that Adam and Eve were like us, Homo sapiens. I can't think of anybody.
I've just started reading, there's a new book by Warren Harzma that has come out, who's affiliated with Biologos. And in the book, he goes through, I think, 4 different possible scenarios for understanding Genesis and Adam and Eve in a theistic evolutionist perspective. So I will have to kind of see where he goes with that. Swamidas, for his part, doesn't even bother addressing the question of Neanderthals as humans, because you can say, well, they're the Genesis, they can be part of the Genesis 1 creation. They could be made in the image of God too, maybe, right? For his perspective, it doesn't matter what we do with the Neanderthals. He probably comes the closest to maybe even allowing for them to be human in some way, but they're not descendants of Adam and Eve. So he says the Bible doesn't really care. Right. I think you're right, though. Pretty much the historic perspective amongst old Earth and theistic evolutionists has been, no, they're not human. Adam and Eve have to be within Homo sapiens. Yeah. And I think we as young Earthers actually stand to be in an interesting position as this debate has been roiling now for about 10 or 15 years, to step in and say, actually we can affirm the humanity of all these if we can place them in the post-flood world and help the rest of you all see that there is a coherent, consistent approach that we can start with Adam and end up with a whole bunch of different people. And not denigrate them as non-human organisms.
So that's very helpful. So the kind of central scientific question that I think Craig is trying to address in his book is, where in this evolutionary timeline, which I think Craig assumes, he kind of just assumes that the evolutionary timeline is, is true. And he's saying, where in this evolutionary timeline do we find Adam and Eve? Where can we find some kind of archaeological signature that says that's where we find the first real humans? So just to help our listeners here, Marcus, because Craig is sort of assuming this evolutionary timeline of human origins, just sketch that out for us. What is this timeline? How long is the timeline that we're thinking about, and where do the various hominins, including the Neanderthals and so on, sort of sit on this timeline?
Yeah, so Craig's basic question is, can we locate Adam and Eve in the paleoanthropological past? Is there some place where they can be the ancestors of all humans? So then that turns on, well, what does the word human mean? And, Craig doesn't give a specific answer to that, in part because he says, listen, there is no agreed upon answer to what is a human. Although I think we would be in agreement that descendants of Adam and Eve is pretty much, that's it.
Yep.
So concerning his view of the timeline, yes, Craig has always held to an ancient Earth and an ancient universe. It's been a staple of the Kalam cosmological argument structure that Todd was talking about at the very beginning, with a Big Bang cosmology that God is the only kind of God out there that could do this sort of stuff. So from the standpoint of looking at Craig's very long and distinguished career, a backdrop of Big Bang and solar Earth evolutionary history has been something that he has never questioned. It's always been taken for granted. I think in part that's one, because he's always thought that it's true, and second, also it becomes a helpful debate component for him. Listen, I can grant you the age of the Earth, I can grant you the age of the universe, and I can still show you that belief in God is a reasonable thing, even with all of the secular approach kind of stacked against me. So I guess in a lot of ways, it's not surprising then that in this book, evolutionary approaches are pretty much just assumed. It's the default. And even though he hints at the possibility of God doing miraculous creative activity, he never even commits himself to that as far as a real necessity, which might surprise a lot of Christians when it comes to the creation of Adam and Eve. So, the timeline, the sequence, the presumed relationships amongst the different hominids, all of that is the backdrop. And as we were just talking about with the question of Neanderthals, then his question turns on what's human. And by looking at the paleoanthropological evidence, he concludes that Neanderthals should be understood as human. We certainly are human. And so whatever our ancestor is, that ancestor must have been human in order to pass humanity on in both directions. So he's going to end up focusing on what is the ancestor for humans and Neanderthals, and technically the Denisovans as well. And that leads him to this taxon called Homo Heidelbergensis as the most recent potential common ancestor. Oh, Todd, what have you got there?
I've got Homo Heidelbergensis. This is it, man. 1900.
It's not every top podcast where somebody just pulls out
a jawbone, right? This is called the Maurer mandible. It was discovered, I want to say 1906 or 1907, somewhere around in there, near the German town of Heidelberg. Hence the name Heidelbergensis. It was named, I think, a year after it was discovered. It's an interesting jawbone. It's different from Homo sapiens. It does not have the protruding chin that we have. There's interestingly room enough in this jaw for all of the molars. The wisdom teeth don't butt up against this back part here. And this back part, this thing here where it joins up to the skull, that's called the ramus. And this is really different from pretty much anything else. So this is Heidelbergensis. This is the original Heidelbergensis, and there have been other remains that have been sort of attributed to this, and there's a lot of current debate among anthropologists about how much of that, is this a real group, or are we just sort of throwing some things in there that we don't know what else to do with? So, but I think that's sort of immaterial to Craig's point, because he's, like you say, he's interested in the ancestor of humans and Neanderthals, and you could call that ancestor Bob for all he cares. It doesn't really matter. So, and how all that evidence, falls out and plays out, I don't think that really matters. So even though I sort of chuckle every time he talks about Heidelbergensis as being a really defined category, you just sort of have to read through that and understand that he's not taking it that way.
Yeah. And even in the last chapter of the book, you get to almost the last page and he says, it doesn't really even matter if we call it Heidelbergensis or something else.
Right.
It's like that.
He does finally say that.
That's a convenient placeholder so that, in case somebody says Heidelbergensis doesn't work, my argument, it's
matter.
honestly immaterial to the argument.
Yeah.
Although he seems to make a lot of hay out of this particular taxon. But I think he's right. In the end, if Heidelbergensis isn't valid or isn't nearly what Craig certainly ascribes it to be, there still is some sort of ancestor to sapiens Neanderthal where he could, place his argument.
Yep. So according to kind of standard archaeological dates, in that evolutionary timeline, what kind of dates are we talking about for Neanderthals, for Heidelbergensis, and so on? Just kind of put that in some context for our listeners.
Well, Todd, you can certainly speak to this as well. You pay closer attention to this than most anybody else in young Earth creationism. When we take a look at Neanderthals somewhere, call it 500,000 years or so for the first appearance of it. It's going to be debated because some of the Heidelbergensis material is thought now maybe that's Neanderthal, or sometimes they call it early Neanderthal. Because you got scrappy bits of bone and stuff like that, and little half pieces of the skull, and it's sometimes difficult to sort out. Is this really something different from this? So if we just kind of peg the Neanderthals as showing up about 500,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens showing up somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years ago, that's the timeline for those. So there's overlap between them. The Neanderthals starting a little bit earlier and extending almost to us to the present, but not quite. And then Heidelbergensis, overlaps down on this lower end with everybody as well, showing up. Craig's going to peg, 750,000 years is what he uses as a convenient number. I think he likes that number in part because it's not a million. A million's like too big.
Yeah, scary.
Whereas 750,000 years ago has this, I think, false level of precision to it as well. Mm-hmm. But, Heidelbergensis 700,000 years ago-ish.
Yeah. And just by way of kind of compare and contrast, in the creationist model, these hominin fossils actually have nothing to do with Adam, right? These are post-flood fossils. They're probably post-Babel fossils. These are kind of post-flood pioneers of... and descendants of Noah and his sons who came off the ark. Just help our listeners to sort of understand that contrast. So,
the listeners to this podcast are familiar with hearing creationists talk about things in terms of billions of years ago. Because it's a convention that is helpful for us to discuss what everybody else is using, even though we find ourselves in disagreement with the numbers. So from a young Earth creation standpoint, you've got Adam's creation, and you have the events that happen between creation and the flood. Then the flood comes around and provides the vast majority of our sedimentary record, our fossil record, with some post-flood events adding to that as well. And it's in that context of the post-flood that we have the hominid record, the record of the dispersal of people out into the world, following the flood, following Babel, and those sorts of things. The Ice Age is in here as well. Later in that's towards the latter part of the human dispersal, helping us to get to places like North America and South America. So the hominid record is really, way towards the top of all of these layers of rock and all these fossils. It's just in the last 2 million years, according to conventional dates, 2.5 million years. And for the young Earth creationists, it's only starting a few thousand years ago, this rapid dispersal of people finally leaving after the flood and after Babel.
Mm. So that
means we're going to be putting all these different species as varieties of people that are migrating around and eventually meeting each other, sometimes having kids with one another, sometimes wiping each other out. In a very different sort of fashion. So we're not arguing about necessarily the sequence of events that we're seeing in these layers. We're arguing about the timing of it all.
Yeah. And really, I mean, this kind of underscores the point that as young age creationists, we think that the theistic evolutionists are actually looking for Adam in completely the wrong place, because they're trying to find him in a timeline that is essentially post-flood, post-Noah, post-Babel. And that's
right.
Not the place where you're going to find Adam, right? So just so that our listeners kind of understand that.
And so in that way, I think Craig is closer to right, although he's looking for Adam he's actually on the path back towards Noah.
Yeah.
Because
Right.
the record of hominids prior to the flood, we just don't have. But what we do have for the record of hominids are the people who are the descendants of Noah and his family over time. Whether we're looking at Neanderthals or sapiens, or whether we're looking at Erectus and a variety of the other species as they're often referred to. So for us as young earthers, we're looking at all of this as post-flood. We're not looking for Adam in all of this.
Right.
We're ultimately looking for Noah.
Join us at the Cascadia Creation Conference, in person or online, and be amazed and encouraged by the glory of God's good design, even in our fallen creation, as we look forward to the promise of a new creation in which righteousness dwells. The Cascadia Creation Conference is coming April 22nd and 23rd to Bothell, Washington, north of Seattle, and streaming online. This conference will bring together leading creation scientists and thinkers to consider the themes of design and brokenness in creation, and what the Bible has to say about the natural history of the world in which we live. The Bible records a pivotal event in Earth's history, the fall of man and the entrance of sin and all its destructive effects into creation. Today we see the initial perfection of God's creation through a glass darkly marred by the effects of sin. At the Cascadia Creation Conference, we will explore the implications of sin and the curse upon creation. We will examine the fields of biology, geology, and astronomy, and learn that even in their broken, fallen state, God's creative works continue to proclaim His glory and point us toward the hope of a better future. Speakers at the Cascadia Creation Conference will be Dr. Gordon Wilson from New St. Andrews College, host of the creation documentary The Riot and the Dance; paleontologist Dr. Matt McLean from the Masters University; aerospace engineer Spike Saris of creationastronomy.com; and Dr. Jeremy Lyon from Truett McConnell University, president of the Creation Theology Society. Admission to the in-person event is $20 and live stream access is $10. Buy your tickets or get more information at creationconf.com. That's creationconf.com.
So, having established that Craig is kind of working within this evolutionary timeline, and we have a very different understanding of how we interpret these hominin fossils. Could you, we've said that Craig is looking for evidence of true humanity. That's what he's looking for in the archaeological record. Could you just help us to understand what is Craig's methodology? What is it actually he's looking for in the archaeological record, so that he can say, this is a signature of humanity and this is not humanity? So, what kinds of things is he looking for in the record?
And especially as he's considering in time, his focus is on when is the earliest date that we could have Adam way down in time. What is the last date that we could have for Adam that could possibly explain things? And he uses very different criteria to establish the earliest possible date for Adam versus the later. We'll put the later here first. The latest possible date he thinks is constrained by artwork. By the time that we have people making stencils of their hands or painting ice age animals running around and hunting scenes and things like that, it's like, listen, we've got people. And I agree, if you're looking at artwork, you've got humanity. So he says that is the last possible time where we could peg humans. So we're looking at cave art, generally speaking, 30, 40 to possibly 50,000 years ago on the conventional timescale. That's the last point where we could say Adam could be the ancestor for everybody who's left. But what's the earliest? Well, the earliest, he says, basically, we need the right brain size. And I was kind of disappointed a bit, because in his discussion of paleoanthropology that happens, he really just hones in on one aspect, and that is, what's the cranial capacity of the organism? And if for the listeners here, cranial capacity is just the volume. What is the volume of brain that you can have inside that skull, measured in cubic centimeters, sort of thing? And basically, he just says, okay, Homo sapiens has got X range. The Neanderthals are in that range, a little bit bigger, in fact. Heidelbergensis is within that range, and anything smaller than that, I don't think so. I don't think that they have brains big enough. So, he discusses this on page like 260 to 264, and it was a really light discussion of a question that I thought was really, really important. So, when it comes down to the brain size, then he basically has Homo neanderthalensis, ourselves, Heidelbergensis, possibly another disputed taxon of Homo antecessor, maybe some of the erectines, but he kind of arbitrarily divides those into an early and late group. The late, maybe; the early, certainly not. And then really ends up just saying it's Heidelbergensis and on up. And missing from this discussion was any sense of post-cranial, from the neck down. What does the organism look like? For other aspects of craniofacial data, none of that is there. Are they upright walkers? Well, they are by default. He's already kind of excluding everything that isn't, but he doesn't discuss that aspect or why. And for the important question of what counts as the earliest possible date for humanity, picking just cranial capacity, I felt was really strange. I don't know about you guys as you read through.
I think he seemed to seize on this notion that sort of comes up in anthropology from time to time, that there's a correlation between, say, what we might call behavioral complexity, right, and cranial capacity, and that's it's curious, right? So what you get that from is sort of observing cranial capacity increasing over time. If you plot, say, cranial capacity of skulls versus their radiometric date, you will get a pretty general trend. And he has a picture of that in his book here, sort of a little oversimplified, but it's there, that shows this sort of trend of increasing brain size. And so the evolutionist then takes that and he looks at, say, chimpanzee brains, which are very small, and human brains, and he says, well, the difference between what makes us human and not, animalistic like a chimpanzee must be something to do with that increase of brain size, right? But if you actually look at people and their cranial capacity and how smart they are today, there's no correlation between brain size and any sort of intelligence or behavioral complexity. And I think there's two big ones that you were pointing out earlier, Marcus, when we were chatting about this, two important exceptions that Craig just sort of blows by. You want to fill us in on that?
Yeah, we have a couple of very, very small-brained hominids, and at least one of those, and I'll leave you to talk about the other one, but I'll bring up one. I know you can talk about the other one. Poses a significant challenge to that. That's Homo floresiensis.
Yeah.
Now it's on that chart, but never discussed anywhere in the text. I was looking in the index, looking through the chapter. He never discusses floresiensis. So to put this in context, Homo floresiensis is a hominid found on the Isle of Flores, Indonesia. And we have a couple of skeletons, one really, really good skeleton. And the individual is only 3'5" or 6" tall.
Yeah.
I mean, really, really tiny. And everything about them was tiny. It wasn't like they were an African pygmy, which has short stature, but a relatively large head. Still smaller generally than yours and I, but only by a little bit. This person was entirely shrunk down. In a lot of ways, the cranial capacity of the Flores skeleton was smaller than that of the average chimpanzee. Yeah. It's like 417 cubic centimeters compared to the chimpanzee, which is 430, 435, something like that. So here you've got individuals that are bipedal, have hands and feet much like ours. The feet are a little big. They got called hobbits because of their small stature and the timing of their discovery, which was around the last Lord of the Rings movie. So it was perfect, from a standpoint of marketing for them. They got known as the hobbits. And they had to have gotten to this island by boat. This island was never connected to the Indonesian mainland or to mainland Asia. By at least 8 to 10 miles worth of open ocean across some of the most difficult channels in all of the oceans out there. I mean, it's a precarious idea, even for modern folks, to think, okay, we're going to go across this area, and to lash together a bunch of trees with vines and pilot yourself across, whether that was the diminutive Flores people themselves or potentially larger statured ancestors that eventually dwarfed on the island. which we see happen in the paleontological record with other organisms as well. There's pygmy mastodons called stegodon on that island. So you got diminutive people hunting diminutive mastodons. The proportions are still about the same, so it's a daunting task. So here you've got people that are in caves associated with fire and tools, and yet their brains are literally, their heads are like this big. They are really, I have a skull that I would show my class and hold it up to them. It's like really tiny. So here they were as tall as, say, my 6 or 7-year-old daughter was, with a smaller cranial capacity, and they're hunting organisms on the island with, weapons.
Yep.
So clearly they have the mental capacity, and their date is very young. As far as radiometrically, they're probably somewhere around 60,000 years ago. So here you have these really small statured, not modern people. They look different, but they're recent. So it's not like this is from the deep ancestral past. We've got small people with small brains doing people things. And there's no discussion of how this might impact Craig's view of cranial capacity.
Right. That's a pretty big counterexample, I would think. I mean, because you're right. Yeah. They're associated with stone tools. They're out on an island, so they had to get over there somehow. They're using fire. They're hunting. That's the same sort of thing he would say is evidence of humanity in Neanderthal, but he doesn't really say anything about Flores. So.
Yeah,
and of course we have another counterexample, which is I think, Todd, you can tell us about Homo naledi.
Yeah, Homo naledi,
found in the Rising Star cave system in South Africa. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so there we have people who are similar size, actually a little bit taller than the Flores hominins, but they're also displaying this really remarkable behavior. They're using a deep chamber in a cave to dispose of the bodies of their family members. Let's put it that way. So based on the variation that we can see in the skeletal material that's been excavated there, the anthropologists have proposed this is all basically multiple generations of probably a pretty closely related tribe or family, something like that. They're the only thing down there except for a couple of other random animal bones. And they've been placed down there at multiple points in time. You can just see that based on the way they're piled up and the way the bones are articulated or not articulated and so forth. So if you imagine, somebody crawling back into the deep cave in the complete dark zone, so they're going to need to be able to climb, right? And they're going to need to be able to see. So they probably somehow would have had fire. And so to do that, and then to have this idea that, we need to put these bodies somewhere, at the very least outside the camp, where they're not going to attract predators or whatever. That's a pretty sophisticated, complicated behavior there that I think is human myself. But either way you go, I mean, there's another example where you have a small-brained individual engaging in some fairly sophisticated behavior that he just doesn't really address at all. He just says, 1,000 cubic centimeters is about where you get human behavior possible. But I just don't think that matches what we know.
Yeah. So, Marcus, just try to sketch out then for us, what is the kind of scenario Craig is proposing here? So, he's using this evidence of modern cognitive behaviors in the fossil record, evidence of cranial capacity and so on, to try to pinpoint where Adam is in the record. But just fill out the details. So presumably, his Adam is still descended from earlier generations of hominins. He's not created from the dust of the ground. Presumably he's part of a population. He's not just a specially created, individual. So this is a bit different, obviously, than the traditional sort of Adam that we kind of would be familiar with. So just sort of fill out the details here for us.
Yeah, and it's sometimes hard to think through this because he's using the name Adam, right, to describe this individual. But as you guys have already gone through with Hans, he thinks that Genesis 2 is myth. It doesn't have any real correspondence to historical events. The anthropomorphic nature of God is something that Craig just seems to have this anaphylactic reaction to, that it can't possibly be that, God would have, breath that he would breathe into the nostrils and hands to make things. It just is like, this is clearly just mythological discussion, which, kind of rules out all the Old Testament discussions of God.
Yeah. I thought about that myself.
Yeah. You kind of think, okay, so Moses is on Mount Sinai and he gets to see God. God says, I can't let you see my full glory. I'm going to let you see my back. And you're like, but God doesn't have a back. Like, well, how else is God going to tell us that he's, limiting his glory in some fashion here? So, you compare the stories of Genesis 2 and 3, which Craig says are so obviously mythological, to the other accounts of the patriarchs in the later chapters of Genesis, where, God reveals himself to Abram, manifests himself as a human to Abram, wrestles with Jacob.
Yeah.
Is that anthropomorphic? So, that's part of the problem that I have when we're trying to think about, well, what does Craig think about what happened deep in the past, is that we have to jettison any idea that what Genesis has said has any bearing on the events whatsoever, even though he's using the word Adam. I think Craig's only using the word Adam here out of convention and the fact that one of the references in the New Testament that he agrees points to a historical Adam uses the name Adam. So he's stuck with it. Otherwise, he could be talking about our original ancestor without ever using the word Adam. And that might actually be more clear because he doesn't have the Adam of the Old Testament in mind here. Rather, he's going to say a couple of, maybe God could, at one point he says that maybe God could have used a mutation in order to increase the cognitive capacity and make Adam and Eve. And so he allows for, potential ancestral stock, that this isn't the first Homo Heidelbergensis out there. Homo Heidelbergensis is a community, and God wants to make one of those or two with Eve, if we even are committed to her name, which I don't know that he is. Those two are going to be the first pair that we call human. And so that's going to be, we don't know. He's not clear enough to let me know if that is simply providentially guided mutation, specifically enacted mutation by God through, whatever means that he finds acceptable, or what. He just thinks that, sooner or later, we've got Adam and Eve. And that's a thin gruel for me. I really don't see how a mutation, especially talking about it as if it's as if one mutation is going to do anything of substance to help with our cognitive capacities and spiritual development.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. I don't know what to do with that.
So Craig is proposing a historical Adam, but it doesn't seem to be the historical Adam, as described in Genesis. I also want to bring up this term universal progenitorship. I want to dig into that just a little bit, because there's this idea that Joshua Swamidass has put forward in an earlier book, this idea that Adam was a genealogical ancestor, which means that he contributed to our ancestry, but he was not a sole progenitor. He was just one among many, and there was this whole population. Now, Craig, I think, by placing Adam further back in time, wants to sort of move more towards a kind of universal progenitorship model, where Adam actually is the ancestor of all of modern humans. But then he kind of rose back on that a bit, in places in the book. So he almost kind of wants to have his cake and eat it. Just sort of tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, Craig spends 300 plus pages working out his argument for a universal progenitor, the idea that Adam and Eve are that their lineage becomes the source for all humans on the planet, and that are here and ever have been. And then at the very end of the book, he throws in the possibility that, well, maybe their kids were also mating with the other Homo Heidelbergensis kids that were out there, which is just taking Swami Das's argument and moving it 700,000 years ago. Because if this is the case, that means that there is a parallel track for some time of people that are made in the image of God and are part of God's group, and members of the same exact species that are not. And
right.
What do you do with this? You've got a situation where humans are mating with non-humans by Craig's own non-definition, but categorization. And he even throws out the B word.
Yeah, bestiality. He's willing to
bestiality.
say that. Mm-hmm. Which I don't think other people are. At least I haven't noticed that. Too much willingness to do that.
Why would you? Right?
I wouldn't do it.
If you could avoid bringing up this topic, not just letting the pesky young earthers point out that this is what your argument means.
Yeah.
But he full out just says, it's not a problem. Because sooner or later they're so deluded that, well, that's really, yikes. I don't see how this is biblically acceptable in any situation at all. I think he even goes so far as to say the prohibition in the law against bestiality, is evidence that there's a problem, but not with making kids. Yeah. Right? That's not the problem.
Yeah, that's not the problem. Yeah,
that is not the problem. It has to do with the proper order and function of the world, and us in particular is made in the image of God, and as the dominion and ruler group over this, that we follow and work in concert with the proper role and function that God has created here. Right. But right there on page 378, Craig allows this possibility and retreats, in a sense, into a Swamidas-like genealogical argument. And I think, in one sense, he's honest enough that this is what you have to do. I don't know that there really is a theistic evolutionary perspective that can avoid this, unless you're willing to say that the very first member of X species was created by God in the past. And you're willing to also say that there's no way that we could prove or disprove that, right? You have to completely lock it outside of science and say, maybe the first Homo heidelbergensis was made by God and it didn't come from Antecessor or Erectus or anyone else. But that also defeats the approach that Craig takes in granting all of this stuff in the first place.
Yeah.
So you're left with a really difficult catch-22. Do you embrace the reality of your argument, or do you try to retreat into an unfalsifiable statement? Craig at least says, we'll go for it. It's 4th and 1, because if not, we have to admit that the young earthers are right in their hermeneutical claims. And as he says, that is
would be a tragic,
basically his worst nightmare. Is the horrible possibility. Or terrifying possibility is the word that he used.
Yeah, terrifying possibility.
It's an interesting. You're right about his little 180. I was just looking in the book there. He's got a whole chapter, 30 pages, which is actually kind of a small chapter for him. But there's a whole chapter on this whole genomic issue and can you actually have two ancestors? And he makes all of these long arguments, very technical things having to do with population genetics and so forth. And he says it's possible to have 500,000 years ago, two ancestors that were the real genetic ancestors of all people, including Neanderthals, including Denisovans, and so forth. And then, at the very end, he says, but that doesn't really matter because they could have been, they could have mated with the members of the tribe that weren't human, and that would have been fine. Bestiality would work too. And it is sort of, It's one of those about faces that happen so fast you almost get literary whiplash, thinking, "Wait a minute,
Oh yeah,
what?"
it's like, I almost spewed the coffee. Like as I
Yeah.
what wait,
Right,
I got through 370 pages of this argument to come
Yes.
to this conclusion.
To come to this conclusion, right?
I was flabbergasted. I was shocked to see this. This is so strange.
And in all of that, he never deals with inbreeding depression, which is a pretty well-known phenomenon in population genetics. And if he wants a world where Adam's evolving from, ancestors and God specially endows two individuals, inbreeding depression would be a pretty problematic thing, because that's usually what we see happening in modern populations that are reduced to just two members. You get weird traits showing up in their offspring because they've got these two individuals will have a high frequency of some bad gene that you don't see when you're in a genetically healthy population. And we get around that because we just have, a created genome that is not full of these sorts of mutations. So we actually, the creationists have a leg up on them there, because we can have our ancestors without having to deal with the inbreeding depression problem. But he can't escape that. He never mentions that at all, never says a word about it. So I was kind of disappointed, because that's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons why we have at least a scientifically satisfying answer to the question of where does Cain get his wife? It can be from his niece, sister, etc., because we don't have this frequency of broken genes. This is the very beginning. Right. Adam and Eve are not created with a whole bunch of genetic baggage, whereas Craig is starting with an existing population of Homo Heidelbergensis, which had to come from another population. So you've got this load of broken genes, and you can't get around that unless you're going to start positing that God is fixing everything along the way, or making new mutations to create genetic diversity, which is not going to be an argument that he's going to want to make, because it's an unfalsifiable ad hoc sort of situation. It's not going to win him a debate, against an evolutionary biologist.
Now, at the beginning of this episode, Marcus, you made a comment, which is that Craig, actually, when you put him in the context of all of the other sort of authors who are writing about the historical Adam, question, he's actually on the conservative end of the spectrum. And he is wanting to preserve some kind of historicity, at least, even if it's this kind of strange category of mytho-history. He's wanting to preserve something that's a historical core. And in his rejoinder in the Sapientia, there was a discussion on the Sapientia website, and in his rejoinder to the various essays there, he said something very interesting. He said, look, my proposal basically preserves biblical inerrancy, potentially preserves sort of universal progenitorship, although, as you say, he then kind of does this weird sort of about turn at the end. He says it preserves some kind of historicity to the fall, but it's also fully compatible with evolutionary science. And he sees this obviously as the big advantage, the big selling point of his proposal. But then he says there is a cost. And the cost, he says, is that we have to give up the recent dates of the events of the primeval history. So he acknowledges there's a cost, but he says, that's a price that's well worth the benefits. That's what he says in the Sapientia rejoinder. So what do you think about that? How successful do you think he has been in actually preserving the historical core to the Genesis account?
That's a good question, and Craig seems to think that he's got a good beat on this. I think that he has a rather peculiar view of inerrancy if he's going to be making this kind of argument, because his view of inerrancy is going to be one that is reducing the claims of Scripture so much so that it's actually hard to argue that the Bible doesn't make minimalist claims. So in lead up to that, I've got the page over here. was on page 202 after a lot of his discussion about mythology, mythohistory, etc. He lays out 10 claims that the Bible makes about primeval history. Right. And this is pretty thin stuff. I mean, God is a personal, transcendent creator of all physical reality, perfectly good and worthy of worship. Well, I agree. I completely agree.
Yep.
That we get that from more than primeval history. But man is the pinnacle of physical creation. Okay, I agree again. He's designed the physical world as the ultimate source of its structure and life form. Sure, I can agree on these sorts of things. But to say, as he does, man is gendered. Well, yeah. Is that a core truth that we pull out from Genesis 1, for example, or Genesis 1 through 3, that God's plan is to bless mankind, that one day is set apart for rest? I mean, technically God rests on one day, but we're not told to do the same until you get to, the Mosaic law. So, these are sorts of things that they sound like good Christian truths, and they are, but is this all that primeval history is telling us? I mean, it's not telling us when God created or how, or that God's creation was a personal act, or that we have a tragic fall that is historical. There's a lot of stuff in this list that is just really bland, and I just don't see this as, they're so bland that they also can't be evaluated any other way. There's no historical claims that are being made. And that is this kind of strain of defensive Christian apologetics that I'm seeing, that if we can make sure that the Bible doesn't make claims that science could potentially falsify, then we're fine. That was Swamidas's approach. The entire approach to his book was putting Adam and Eve in a place where science couldn't say I'm wrong. Right. And Craig is making, as a philosopher, he's making philosophical arguments that science can't touch, and saying that these are the core claims of Christianity. The history of the Christian church stands completely against, this type of minimalist, watered down, system.
When in effect you kind of try to insulate your Christianity from criticism by making all of its claims completely impervious to any kind of critique from reality, then you've essentially come up with religious claims that everybody can just safely ignore and go about their business and pay no attention to. I mean, that's the sad truth, isn't it?
Yeah, and also when we think about how God evidences himself in the Old Testament and the New, right? With a mighty hand I brought them out of Egypt. If that didn't happen, there's no reason why the Israelites should worship God. God stakes his reputation on the things that he did in the past. The apostles, the disciples went to the gallows, right? They went to the cross, they were stoned, they were sawn asunder, right? All these things, they died because of the belief in the physical, historical, real resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, Craig believes in that. But what he misses here is that that God consistently argues that historical events display the reasons why you should believe in God and in Jesus Christ. If we don't have the physical resurrection of Jesus, as Paul says, we are of all people most miserable. We've made a terrible mistake in believing in Jesus if there isn't a historical resurrection. If there isn't a real Adam and a real fall, we have no basis for making basically any of the moral claims that we have in the rest of the Bible. So I think that his approach to inerrancy is one that jettisons historical reality. And that is a price that there's, as you said, this is a fine price to pay. No, this is not a price to pay. I'm not going to pay that price. I'm not going to pay the price for a whole lot of other things.
Yeah. There's an essential historicity to Christianity that doesn't begin with the Gospels, right? It stretches right back to page 1 of Genesis. And that essential historicity is something that many of us are not prepared to kind of give up. Now, really, when it comes down to it, I think one of the reasons why Craig takes this view that is that, as you mentioned earlier, he's absolutely terrified that the young age creationist hermeneutical claim might actually be right. And the reason he says he's terrified about that is because he thinks that if the hermeneutical claim is correct, then our task of reconciling what the Bible says with science is just completely hopeless. We just have to throw in the towel. What do you think about that, Marcus?
Grab the towel, guys. I hear that.
Oh my.
Podcast over. That's it. No. Not inviting
It's
this
spooky.
guy again. Wait. Obviously, here's the three of us, right? We're all scientists. We've got biologists, geologists here, and we don't think that's necessary. I think Craig might do well to consider the fact that within young Earth creationism, we actually have a lot of science people who think that there are ways around it. It's not to say that we don't think that there are difficulties. All of us know that there are very large and substantial problems when it comes to dealing with the science and the biblical issues from a young Earth creation standpoint. Nonetheless, we've had certain kinds of successes that give us a good deal of hope that we're on the right track over here. Craig is of a very different opinion. He thinks that, basically if we say young Earth is right, we are doomed, right? Herein lies Christianity. It had a good run, but it's over. And I just don't see that. And as a philosopher, I am surprised that he doesn't think that there are other options, right? I mean, there are other philosophical approaches to science and faith that one could take that would conceivably allow you to hold to a young Earth and recognize, that maybe science is mistaken. Not that I'm an anti-realist, but one could be a scientific anti-realist and take that position. It's within the domain of philosophical possibilities. And as a systematic theology guy and as a detailed philosopher, Craig's not going to go that direction, but he doesn't even say that, there's that, right? Yeah. There's a constellation of possibilities out there, but he doesn't consider any of them viable. The science, as described by our conventional colleagues, must be accepted.
Yeah, as a package, as a whole package. Yeah. You take it or leave it. You either throw it all out and we know nothing, or evolution is true and the universe is billions of years old. Yeah.
Apparently, if we disagree about the potential for radioactive dating to give us a true date, out goes heliocentrism. Yeah. I mean, it's a bizarre. It's a bizarre situation. But he's not alone in holding to that kind of bizarre idea. There's lots of folks within the theistic evolutionary community and within the skeptical atheist community that say, listen, as soon as I don't understand why you young Earth creationists even use the stove, for crying out loud. It's technology, right? Here you are, you live on science, you parasites, right? And you go, you're not thinking this through.
Yeah. And how well do you think Craig actually understands modern young age creationism? Do you think he has a really good grasp of our scientific position?
No, not remotely. He's never considered it important enough to bother looking at it.
That's the impression I got.
Not even casually. One gets the impression reading the book that he picked up a couple of young Earth sources. One, because they were in books talking about things and they just happened to be there. They're in multi-views books and things like that. He uses one young Earth creation commentary on Genesis from Sarfati and leans a little heavy on that. I was surprised that he treated it as well as he did. I was expecting him to treat it worse. So I think Sarfati should feel pretty good about the way that he was portrayed in Craig's book here. But Craig has not the slightest idea of how young Earth creationists approach scientific issues. Right. I mean, at one point he says that all the history of the evolution of the dinosaurs has to happen post-flood, pre-Abram.
Right.
And
that's on pages. That's pages 130 and 131 where he's talking about creationism, and he's got that one. That's a good one. And I remember reading that thinking, I don't know what you're talking about. What is that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So apparently the flood makes all the geology, but then the dinosaurs have to re-evolve in new rocks, or something. You kind of go, well, you didn't think this one through. You didn't ask anybody, or you didn't even ask anybody who knew. His idea of young Earth creationism probably hasn't matured past, having read Whitcomb and Morris and a couple of others back in the 80s. And he just, that was silly then, according to his ideologies, just left it. There's no point for him to engage. So,
and let's be frank. I mean, that is the approach of a lot of theistic evolutionists, not to put too fine a point on it. Dennis Alexander, in his book Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? I mean, he only cites one creationist book, and that's Whitcomb and Morris, and that's it.
That's the only one that matters, Paul. not your book, not things that Todd has done, not Kurt's book or Andrew Snelling's 2 volumes, Earth Catastrophic. That's all fluff, around the edges. And I think you're right. It's because they just don't think there's anything here worth reading, so they don't bother. Right. And yet we keep showing up right in these multi-volumes. So I'm going to be in a multi-volume book with Craig debating this issue. There's kind of like this feel of a need that we have to have the young earthers involved. We've got to have them in there to show that I don't know, we're
how
diverse.
Stupid they are.
Yes. Hopefully we'll surprise them in that respect.
Maybe.
Wait a minute. Maybe we'll surprise them with how stupid I am. I don't know, but we keep just hanging around, and we hang around for good hermeneutical reasons and increasingly for good scientific reasons. And I think we are, standing in a position where we're actually where we have some room to maneuver in here that we probably didn't have room, in the 90s or the early 2000s, even. I think that the approach to jettison Adam that is being pushed by so many of the evolutionary creation community has gotten a lot of people scared. And so, Swaminas's book was a pushback in saying, no, you could have a real Adam as long as it's genealogical. Craig's approach is saying, no, you can have a real Adam if you put him far enough back in the past, with a lot of cost to go with that. I think a lot of young earthers can come up and say, nobody's paid attention, but actually we've been working pretty hard on this for a while. Here's a model that actually can work. And there just might be enough people out there looking at the options to say, you know what, let's take another look at this. And I think that's
good idea.
Very, very possible. Yeah.
Well, Marcus, that's brilliant. I think we'll draw things to a conclusion there. Thanks so much for helping us to sort of navigate through all the complexity of the argument in Craig's book. That's really great. It's been very, very
appreciate
helpful.
it, Paul. And I always appreciate being complimented by a British guy, because they'll call you brilliant. Where here in the United States, that's a big deal.
No, it's been great to have. It's been great to have you, and no doubt we'll have you back on the podcast again in the future.
Excellent.
Todd, at the moment, I don't think we know precisely what's going to happen in the next episode. But if people come back in a fortnight's time, we will have something equally fascinating to today.
We'll all be surprised.
Serve up. We'll all be surprised. So everybody, if you want to check out all of our streaming platforms and our show notes, you can go to coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast. If you have questions or comments that you want to send to us, and we do love to hear from our viewers and listeners, you can email us at podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, like and share our episodes, tell your friends, leave us a positive review, all of those great things. That really, really helps us. And of course, we always close out by saying, if you enjoy the content that we're producing and if you appreciate what we're doing, please do consider sending us a donation. You can do that for Biblical Creation Trust. If you go to our website, biblicalcreationtrust.org, on our homepage, there's a donation button. And if you click on the donation button, it will take you to our giving page, and all of the various options are laid out there, including our PayPal account. Todd, how would people support Core Academy of Science?
same deal. Go to coresci.org. That's coresci.org/connect. And that page will take you to information about the ministry and pages that we think are important, as well as places to find out how to make a contribution. You could also go to coresci.org/donate. That will also have our address where you can send checks or online donations through PayPal.
Yeah.
And Marcus, do tell us about Cornerstone again.
Yeah, a third way to help out here is that, those of us at Cornerstone, I started this company so that we could help take, the needs that people had for the stuff that they require for their science, and from the proceeds and some of the profits of our company, funnel that back into creation research. So we are thrilled to support Core Academy and especially the Sanders scholarships that are offered to students, so that there are students that are being mentored in creation research, so that not only do these guys do some of the heavy lifting, but we want to partner with them and help and support in whatever way that we can. So if you purchase science supplies from Cornerstone, you'll know that a portion of those proceeds are going to go to help ministries like Biblical Creation Trust, Core Academy of Science, and especially help students to be mentored in creation over the course of their academic careers.
That's great. So do go and check out Cornerstone Educational Supply, everybody. That would be fantastic. And we will see you in another couple of weeks. See you then.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.